Hey everyone, it's Brandon Garrett with National Minority Equality Forum. I am here at Xavier University of Louisiana, actually pulling double duty on another health panel at the university. So say to some of our docs, some 40 under 40 winners. Hello. We're going to talk health equity here, but there we're going to talk your health, your vote. I'm so happy to have one of my coworkers, essentially my other spoiled little sister, Stephanie Young, who is the executive director of When We All Vote. I know Stephanie really well in that we were on the CBC team together back in 2010 and 2012, and all know that me and I were on the Health Brain Trust team together. So I will go ahead and turn it over to you guys.
Well, it's great to be here as always with the National Minority Equality Forum. Thank you, Brandon, for bringing in some of the 40 under 40 energy into this conversation as well. We are very excited, and I'm speaking we because I know that the audience is quite excited, as am I, to be joined today by Stephanie Young. She's a highly sought after thought leader at the intersection of culture, social impact, and democracy, big D democracy. And Stephanie, as the executive director, is also a leading communications and brand strategist with a proven track record of building strong connections, of developing messaging, developing content, as well as creative solutions for issues that involve culture, entertainment, justice, and again, democracy, particularly in private and public sectors. So she's going to talk to us about the work that she does at When We All Vote as the ED, which is, and I'll remind people, it's a nonpartisan voting initiative, which the previous First Lady, Michelle Obama, did launch in 2018. So Stephanie is going to talk about her extensive time, not just in terms of strategic communications and public engagement, but she's going to talk to us about specifically what's going on now and all of the things that matter with respect to voting. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that aside from being an alum of the Obama White House, she's also worked on myriad political campaigns for House Democratic leadership. She's worked for leading television networks, including BET and NBC Cable Entertainment. And of course, she'd be upset, I'm sure, if I didn't mention that she's a proud graduate of Hampton University, but she currently resides in Los Angeles. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mia. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you all for being here today. We are literally 4 days away from the midterm elections. And this is probably the most critical midterms I think that we've had in modern history. And I know that folks say quite often that this is the most important election of our lifetime. I think that we have to remind ourselves that every election is literally the most important election of our lifetime, because when we don't vote, other people show up. And we don't recognize our communities, our neighborhoods, our cities, and our states, or this nation. And me, if it's okay, I can give a little bit more background on When We All Vote before we get into our Q&A.
Yes, let's do that for sure.
Right. Yeah. So When We All Vote is a nonpartisan initiative launched by former First Lady Michelle Obama in 2018. And our whole mission is to change the culture around voting and to increase participation in every election by closing the voting race and age gap. So what does that mean? That means that we focus a lot on organizing and energizing communities of color, focused on young people. We have a high school program called My School Votes. We have a voting squad program that's for everybody, and we just launched on historically Black college campuses. And we work with anyone you can think of, from the Divine Nine to other organizations that have membership and help to create voting programs for them throughout the year. So we take that organizing that we do in states all around this country, and we partner that with our culture work, because you can't change the culture if you're not a part of it. And so what that means is that we work very closely with the entertainment, the music, sports community to get those athletes, influencers, and artists involved in the work that we're doing. We create pathways to reach voters in a multitude of different ways, from, a big award show stage to a music festival to jumping on Versus. It doesn't matter. We want to be in the mix, and we want to be a part of the cultural zeitgeist so that we're able to tap into people's consciousness and have a voting message and just a message about civic engagement at large. So our whole goal in changing the culture is really being a part of it, infiltrating it, and using those messengers and those platforms to really bring people into the work, to either just register and vote or to take it a step further and volunteer their time. What we know is that when folks are reached out to and actually people ask them to vote, they're more likely to participate. When they vote together, they're more likely to vote. When there's a celebratory event in a polling place, people are more likely to actually show up. That's why we have over 180 events that we've had all around this country and still having at early voting sites. And these are what we call parties at the polls to get more people out to vote. And I mentioned how this is the most critical election of our lifetime, or critical election, midterm election. I want to just explain what I mean by that, and because I want to make sure that we understand what's happening right now. We just saw an insurrection. I know it feels like a while ago, but we just saw an insurrection and violence at our nation's capital. We have seen continual lies about the 2020 election not being legitimate. And this is being pushed and provoked by sitting elected officials. We've seen the Speaker of the House and her husband literally beat almost to death by a hammer. And I think that we are still kind of going on like everything's normal, and it's just not. And what's really at stake right now is not just the political violence that we're seeing, but it's the fact that we have people who are holding positions and who are running for positions who don't believe in democracy. They don't believe in expanding the right to vote, and they don't. They continue to peddle misinformation about what happened in 2020, and that is a dangerous place to be in, because after all these years, the United States has slid into a backsliding democracy for the first time ever. And democracy all over the world has been and is being threatened with the rise of social media, with the rise of the way in which we have disinformation spreading. We are at a place in time where we're going to have to choose: do we want an autocracy or do we want a democracy? And a democracy is when everybody, no matter who they are, has the chance and the ability to make their voices heard. One person, one vote. And so we've seen over 500 voter suppression bills introduced and or passed since 2020, targeting Black people, targeting communities of color, holistically targeting young people, making it harder to vote. Things like taking away early voting days, which is critical when you are a working person and when you have children, or when you just have obligations, to more stringent voter ID laws. In places like Texas, you can use your gun license, which you don't need anything to get. You use your gun license to vote. But if you go to Texas A&M or if you go to Prairie View University, you cannot use your student ID, to sanctioning essentially voting police in Florida that could potentially lead to voter harassment. So we're at a tipping point in this country. What direction do we want to go in when it comes to strengthening and protecting and expanding democracy? Or do we want to go and fall on the other side of autocracy? And I know that that's not what we want. And that's why we're organizing. We're working extremely hard to get people out to vote, to celebrate the fact that we are voting, and to ensure that we don't ever get to this place again by helping to train up and educate the next generation of voters, those Gen Zers who are the most diverse group of not African Americans, but most diverse group of Americans. And next to millennials, Gen Z and millennials actually make up the largest voting Bloc in this country over baby boomers. So it's time for our young people to stand up and take their rightful place and make their voices heard, because if voting was not so critical and important, if it did not move the needle, people would not be working so hard to stop us. And we should feel positive because of the voter turnout we saw in 2020, with over 60% of Americans voting, 50% of young people voting. Those numbers have not happened. And we are already outpacing early voting numbers from the last midterm elections in 2018, with over 30 million people casting a ballot around this country. So there's something to be hopeful about, because we are working diligently to shape this democracy to make it more inclusive and more fair. And that only happens when everybody has equal access to the ballot box. So we're excited about this conversation today. I wanted to give you a little bit of a lay of the land, but also a little bit more perspective on the work that we're doing at When We All Vote, because ultimately this stuff is heavy and we try to make it fun. Because who wants to be hum and glum and trying to do this work? Nobody. You have to be positive. So we try to make it fun and insert positivity. And I encourage everybody to follow us on our platforms to see all the positive things we do. And we just brought on Lotto, you know who she is, to be one of our newest ambassadors. And we're really excited about the energy that we're bringing on the ground all around the country. So with that, Mia, I will be quiet.
Please don't be quiet, because I'm gonna hit it right back to you after I just remind the audience of some housekeeping things. So remember, folk who are out there, if you have questions that you want for Stephanie to address in the moment, please drop your questions right below. And then otherwise, just keep the chat going in the box either this way or this way on your screen, whichever it is on your screen. So chat to the right or the left, drop your questions below. I'm sure we'll have a couple. I want to put a pin in the last part of what you said and come back to it at the last, just before we close, the significance of hope and all of the swelling energy. I want to make sure that we pin that at the core of our conversation. However, let's go back to some of the other things you mentioned. You talked about voter suppression, and specifically about some of the state-sanctioned tactics that are in place, to really discourage people from voting, So on your website, on whenweallvote.org, you have voting information. You list details on how you can host a party at the polls, and you told us a little bit about that going on. And then you also list the number to the election protection hotline. Can you give us a bit more, some additional examples of what voter suppression looks like in real time, and what are some common problems in addition to what you've shared about voter suppression?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mentioned all of the bills the number of bills that have been introduced and or passed around this country. And let me take it a step back to try to lay the groundwork as to kind of where we have been with voting in this country. It was never for anyone but white land-owning men. And in fact, they decided to make election day on Tuesday because, and literally this was back in the 1800s, because I think Sunday was the Lord's Day, obviously. Monday was market day, and Tuesday was the best day for white landowning men to take their buggies and go vote. And we still vote on Tuesday. So clearly,
I never knew that, Stephanie. Thank you for giving that. That's so vivid.
I actually, someone wrote a book about this, and I actually learned a lot of this the other day. I was like, wait, what? I didn't even know Tuesday was picked so long ago. But anyway, that's where we are. So clearly we can change some things in this country. So because the voting rights have been expanded, because it was never meant for anyone else. First it was, more white men. Then eventually when the 15th Amendment came, it was also for, supposedly Black men. We know that didn't really go well eventually. And then it was for white women. And then eventually in 65, 63, it was the Voting Rights Act, which is, I know it happened the exact same year Mrs. Obama was born. It
was Medicare, Medicaid, voting rights, all of that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about in basically a lifetime, right? Where our rights, my grandmother at that time was, I think, 51 years old when she really got the right to vote in this country. And this is my grandmother. So I think that we have to put into perspective that the expansion of voting rights has been a slow thing because it holds so much power. And if we even think about the assassination, I'm a history buff, but the assassination of President Lincoln, it wasn't just because of the Civil War, but he talked about giving Black people the right to vote. And they were like, oh, no, that's not happening. And he was really the first casualty when it came to voter suppression. So we have to remember that voter suppression is kind of ingrained in who we are as a country because this has been happening for centuries. And it holds, again, so much power. So considering that, we're this far away from the Voting Rights Act. What happened in 2013 after President Obama's second reelection? It was the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. And what did they say? The Supreme Court said, well, there's no more racism. You got a Black president, chill out, we're good. Alabama, Georgia, Florida, y'all do your own thing. It doesn't matter. Knowing good and well what was really going on, which was we don't ever want this to happen again. A man named Barack Obama potentially ascending to the highest office of the land when more people vote, and we don't like that. So now we have a gutting of the Voting Rights Act. Now states are running free. And what does that mean? They're able to create their own voting laws with no type of supervision from the Department of Justice. And so that is why we are in this predicament where state after state started to create their own crazy voter ID laws or their own restrictive voter laws and rules and dictate what elections look like in their state and disrupting, the whole process towards more progress when it came to equal access to the ballot box. And then after all of those laws came to be, well, 2020, when you show up in big numbers and you scare people even more, then folks went in and said, let's go ahead and let's make this even more complicated. And let's make sure that we are cherry picking and literally targeting certain communities. So it's super blatant. And when you look at places like Texas, which obviously has a really large landmass, they picked up a lot of their drop boxes where folks were able to drop off their ballot. So if you live, in a rural area, you have to drive 2 hours to actually drop your ballot off. You're trying to discourage people from voting. I already mentioned that voter ID law where literally, you can vote your gun license and not with a school ID. In places like Florida, they are restricting access to voting by mail-in drop boxes through their bills there. So, we had a lot of vote by mail, and I don't have to tell you guys this, considering this is a health forum, but we had a lot of vote by mail in 2020. So and it was effective, right? It worked. So they're trying to destroy that option for many people. And even in Arizona, the governor signed a really dangerous bill that called for proof of US citizenship to vote, obviously targeting, Latinx and Hispanic communities. So at the end of the day, it's very clear who they are trying to stop from voting. And I think that we have to remember voter suppression manifests in 2 different ways, through those laws and barriers that I'm mentioning, right, in these states, but also through the mental belief that my vote doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter what I do, someone's going to stop it from not counting, or someone's going to block me. And when it comes to, I'll even bring in gerrymandering in this, because to me, gerrymandering is another form of voter suppression, because essentially it is where these politicians are able to pick their voters based on, the drawing of their districts. And so if you can never vote someone out of office, why do you want to vote? Why would you want to vote? So it's a depressant to eventually suppress. But I will say this, there are many solutions that are already on the table. Restoring the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that is still out there. That absolutely should happen. The Senate blocked progress on that. And also the Freedom to Vote Act. That bill is so important because it ends things like partisan gerrymandering. It does things like automatic voter registration, where why we have to get registered when we turn 18. Like, why do we have to take that step? A lot of countries have automatic voter registration and mandatory voting, like Australia. And it expands and it updates our system so that we're actually living in 2022 instead of 1863. So we need those pieces of legislation to move. They've already been passed by the House. Okay. So they have to be passed by the Senate, and the Senate won't even take it up. And so that's where we are when it comes to the fight against voter suppression on the legal side, or on the federal side, because it is going to take that federal fix to really, really ensure that we're protecting voters. But voters aren't deterred. They've heard about all of these things. They know what's going on. They are ready. That's why we have our Know Your Rights page, because we want people to feel informed when they go to vote. That's why the Lawyers Committee has their 1-866-OUR vote number that you can literally call anytime. They're not 24/7, but they are literally, like, if you live on the West Coast, the East Coast, they will be available, and you will actually talk to a lawyer who can answer your question from, I don't know where my polling place is, to, oh, I forgot my ID, or I don't have an ID, or do I need to have an ID, to I'm having a problem, they won't let me vote. So we want to make sure that people are armed and equipped, because the only way you can suppress a voter is when they don't know their rights, right? And we want to make sure that people know their rights and they feel not just protected, but they feel like they have some sort of armor going into the door. And the only thing that beats voter suppression, the only thing that beats all of this is high voter turnout.
You gave us so much information just in that. And I want to give just a quick personal anecdote about how significant all these different inroads to voting are. I remember back in 2012, I was living abroad. I had been living abroad at that point for about 2 years. And at that time, I was living in Indonesia, in Asia, right? And so in Indonesia specifically, this was when Obama was running for his second term of presidency. And also we're coming off of a midterm election. I was very adamant to ensure that I could mail in to the US my vote, my voting, essentially my vote card and everything like that.
Your ballot, yeah.
My ballot, yeah. And I was, I'm saying vote card because I'm thinking about the voter registration. Thank you. Mail in my ballot. And it was, the country itself was not doing anything to keep me from from doing that. But I just remember thinking to myself, like, this matters. I feel like this matters. And even more so because I wasn't home. And, you know, and so, and that was a privilege that I had to be able to do that. I felt like it was certainly a privilege. But when you're talking about really trying to galvanize people who, to your point about depression, who feel like their vote is depressed, what other situations does when we all vote find itself in? Are there talks that you all hold with new and upcoming voters? Are there conversations that you might engage in amongst older voters who feel some type of way? Anything like that?
Yeah, so we had a lot at the end of, well, in 21, kind of leading into 22, we hosted a lot of conversations with the Brennan Center, who's a great policy partner, just to talk about really getting those two bills passed, the Freedom of Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and really explaining what the bills would do, trying to build energy, because unfortunately, our Senate, our government doesn't move when we don't move. Some of them try to, right? But it's so important for the people to lift their voices on the issues that they care about, because you actually will see some progress. You really will. Think about George Floyd, right? Obviously, he's a part of a long list of Black men and women who have been gunned down, right? But these massive protests during the pandemic created the opportunity for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And that bill was actually created and, went through the process. And it would not have if there was not a global response to what was going on. And unfortunately for voting, we haven't created that energy on the ground. I think people are just we're hobbling through what we're seeing, and it's just like, no big deal. There's other stuff to worry about. Not understanding that every issue you care about, from healthcare to education to the environment, none of that will be addressed if we don't vote, because it all flows through voting, right? Voting is the first kind of space where you make your voice heard and where you actually can push an issue along. So it's really going to take the people. So we did a lot of work with, let's educate folks on what these bills do. Let's educate them on how to advocate for these issues that they care about. And let's really create pathways for them to call their senators, email them, tweet them, they count all that stuff, right? So how are we building energy around this? And then also, how are we just answering questions? We had the other day, though, for our volunteers and all the people who are hosting events, like a call, and anybody could have joined to talk about voter safety and what to potentially expect. And if you run into problems, what to do. And we did that with our partners at We the Action, which is a group of lawyers, over 80,000 lawyers who volunteer their time on a multitude of issues. And a lot of them volunteer their time on voting rights issues. So like, they're at the polls, they're at our parties at the polls, they're at that 1-866 our vote number, or they're working on, lawsuits for certain states that are discriminating against people on the basis of race or sex or gender, whatever. So it's important for us to educate our audience, and we do that. So if you sign up for to be a part of When We All Vote, just to be a part of our email blast list, we won't bug you too much, but we will alert you to these opportunities. And if you're following us on social platforms, you'll see when these opportunities come up to learn more about what you can do in this space, and so that you're more educated on the issue and more prepared to fight against it.
And then one more follow-up question to this, Stephanie. Obviously, When We All Vote is very invested in pushing information, tangible information, helpful information in advance of the midterm elections. What happens right after the elections are closed and in between, in the in-between time between the end of voting and the next voting cycle?
So we don't go to sleep. With look, our whole mission is to change the culture. You cannot change the culture if you do things the same. And I was literally just sitting with a good friend of mine last night who raises money, and we talked about how fundraising this year was terrible and donors were very reluctant to really give money to the space. And it's probably because it's a midterm election. And if we keep treating these election cycles like that, like cycles, as opposed to how are we not doing 365-day a year, organizing around not just voting, but civic engagement, we would have a different country. Because you can't build relationship, you can't build trust, you can't build all of this, right, build this house and tear it down. So we are very focused on literally on 365 days of activity, of involvement, engagement, learning, all of these things. In fact, I'm talking to my senior team now about what we're going to do for MLK Day. I'm like, let's just get through the election to figure that out. Because I know that we're all going to be exhausted, but that's the thing. It's like, we have to do this work year round. We have to have these conversations year round. We have to organize year round. We have to take action year round. And there's always elections every single year. So we are always on, and we have a multitude of like different volunteer opportunities. So if anyone has a high schooler or knows high school teachers, we have our program, My School Votes. Just right before this call, I was talking to one of our exceptional students in Atlanta and her teacher about what she's planning to do on the organizing front. But these are essentially clubs at high schools where kids are learning how to register voters, but they're learning how to build campaigns. They're learning how to talk about these issues in our school system, where sometimes they don't have the outlet to talk about what's happening in our country. And teachers are so scared now to talk about these things. Well, where are these kids going to get this information if they're not getting it at the table or with their parents? They need their teacher as that last stopgap. So you can become a My School Vote school if you're interested. You can become a voting squad captain, where basically and essentially you are getting your squad, whoever those people are that you name, that are going to go vote with you. They could be voting with you virtually, or they can vote with you physically. And y'all can plan to go vote and take a photo at the voting booth with your hat, not at the voting booth, but at the place. You can't take a photo in the voting booth with a hashtag voting squad. And that's a lower lift. And then if you say, you know what, I'm really interested in going higher, you can be a chapter leader with us. It was our pilot program that we led this year. I'm an AKA, so I was like, I have to have some chapter programs. I can't we have to organize this and have some leadership. So we have chapters now for our voting squad captains, essentially. And what they do is they do deeper organizing, and they really organize their city and their state potentially. And our goal is to have 222 for 22, and we have over 300. So that's a program that anybody could tap into. And then lastly, we have our program called our voting squad program at historically Black colleges around the country. So there are ways that people can tap in throughout the year. And you can also say, you know what, I'm not going to do much. I'll just check my name to be a volunteer. When opportunities pop up, I'll do that. That's enough too. Because I know we all have a lot on our plate, so you don't have to do as much as you want to do, as much as you think you have to do. We want to make it easy. We want to make it fun. And we really, really, really want to build community.
I love that. I wish, Stephanie, that When We All Vote was around when I was a kid. I was just captain of the safety guards. I wasn't on the vote. We didn't have a voting squad. I wish we did, but because I would have, rather than saying don't run in these halls, I'd be like, make sure your parents run to the voting booth, So I want to just remind the audience, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, because I'm not necessarily always looking at the chat. The chat is for you. The Q&A is for us, so that we can get your questions answered. I want to give you another question, Stephanie. So you were talking a little bit about issues that come up on the ballot, right? Across, whether it's federal related questions or just state by state. A lot of the questions tend to fall into the categories of health policy, specifically this year, potentially rights around abortion, LGBTQIA vote rights, gun safety, gun reform rights, even critical race theory, all kinds of things end up on voters' rights, all kinds of things end up on the ballot. How does When We All Vote appropriately and in a nonpartisan way position these issues so that potential voters are galvanized to vote?
So, we, unfortunately, there's so many issues, and this is, to me, another form of voter suppression. So when you are a nonpartisan organization and you're a nonprofit, legally, the IRS tells you what issues are deemed nonpartisan and what issues aren't. So depending on who's, leading our government, a lot of issues that we all care about end up being partisan issues. So, and I want to make this clear, because I think a lot of people don't know this, and I think it's wrong, because how do you talk about, hey, you should vote, but you don't tell people necessarily why? And that, to me, is a preventative measure. But so abortion is considered partisan. Many things around climate change are considered partisan. You can say different things like clean air or pollution, but you can't say certain things. because they were deemed partisan. What else is partisan? Gun rights is partisan, or considered to be partisan. So when you have to cherry pick how you talk about issues from a nonpartisan perspective as a nonpartisan organization to, fall into the appropriate lines, it puts you in a bind to only be able to talk about issues from an educational standpoint. And that's what we do a lot of. So instead of like breaking down, how your vote impacts X, what we say is, here's what the Supreme Court did when they, banned abortions. And this is what this means. Now, these are the elected officials that will be in charge of making these decisions for you. Obviously, these are people you have to vote for. So it is imperative that we do that educational piece first so that folks understand the breakdown of the issue. And then we can tie it back to, this is how it fits in the scheme of how our government works and, who are the people responsible for these things. And people can understand, okay, well, my mayor makes decisions on that, or my governor makes decisions on that. So I have to think about who those people are. There's so many issues, that you brought up, and they're all very important to, I think, each and every one of us. And educating folks on those issues and helping to make that connection that government plays a role is the thing that we do, and that is most important. And we have a ton of slides. And I'm noticing that the longer the slides get on Instagram or social media, the people, I don't know if they lose interest. It's harder. Our attention spans are just shrinking by the moment. The more TikTok videos we watch. But if you take a look, we have a ton of information on anything you can think of and how it ties back to voting, and showing that, all the issues that you do care about are actually on the ballot. And in fact, we partnered with Climate Power, a group that does organizing around climate change, to register voters, to reach them where they are, and to talk about how essentially the Inflation Reduction Act is the largest piece of legislation that will, or policy work that will actually impact climate change, and how none of that would have happened if young people didn't vote at the rates that they did, if they didn't protest, if they didn't lift their voices up, and all of those things. Through our partnerships with some other organizations, we're also able to lift information up. But I look at us as almost like the encyclopedia of, okay, what's going on? How do I learn more about it? And then also better understand how government's in the middle of it as well.
I felt like that was so comprehensive, and obviously that's not an easy issue to tackle, right? So, and really appreciate the fact that you've broken down the fact that the IRS literally delineates what's partisan, what's not. That is not wide known information whatsoever.
No, it's not. And I think that people get frustrated probably with nonpartisan organizations because they're like, well, why can't you talk about X? And it's but people need to know that. But I do know there are folks especially in the climate side, who are planning, legal action against these things, because it's not right. If you live in a country, if you want to talk about why using your voice is important, but you can't talk about the issues that matter most to people, because saying go vote is not impactful or effective for anybody. Vote for what? What am I voting for? So we have to be able, and it shouldn't just be people on partisan sides or politicians that have the ability to talk about issues. People need to have education on issues that don't come from any type of lens or perspective, but just are based on fact, right? And then people can make informed decisions off of that.
A lot of people, to your point about making informed decisions, they go to trusted local leaders, right? And or grassroots organizers, and grassroots advocacy obviously has a long-term and long-time impact on who votes, when, and for what reasons, right? When people, we probably have a lot of grassroots activists who are tuned in right now, or they will watch this recording later on. What issues would you say grassroots advocacy should focus on with respect to voting? And when I say issues, I mean voting issues altogether. I don't mean necessarily singular issues having to do with how you should vote for climate related.
Yeah.
So how do they need to be engaged?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're advocating for anything, you need to be a part of the voting the voting rights movement. Because every issue is a voting issue. Every issue starts at the ballot box. And so and I know a lot of groups get a lot of funding for their work. And I think sometimes, to have like the singular focus on one issue, it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work because you can't get things fully done if you don't include and incorporate voting. And so, there are some groups that have advocated for issue X and then also have like a voter registration arm, right? But I do think whatever the issue is that you care about, I think it is figuring out how are we incorporating not just voter registration, but how are we incorporating voting rights advocacy into our work and understanding the connection and making that connection for people, and putting some of that great funding that you might have behind that work, behind those pushes, and being more coordinated within the organizing kind of coalition of groups that are doing this work, mostly led by the Leadership Conference of Civil and Human Rights and many others. How are you a part of that movement too? And I think that the voting rights movement can also be more thoughtful about how we bring in other issues to the fight for voting rights as well, because that is like, if you think about it as a parade, this is the front of the parade, right? And the issues follow in the back. And they're not back or last, but we got to get through this hurdle first so that we can get through these other hurdles. And once, we have equal access to the ballot box in this country, once we, end all of these voter suppression challenges that we have, or at least try to bring most of them to an end, then you have free reign to really push, advocate, and like educate people on the issue area that you care about. And you have more of a chance of getting something done because you can actually potentially elect candidates in places that you may not have been because more people have access to voting. So I think that, right now we're going through, it's really tough, but we're going through a reshuffling, a reimagining, a rethinking, a regroup basically of this country and the way in which we approach all of this, and understanding kind of, look, this house was built on shaky ground. Let's be clear. The United States of America is an amazing idea that we're reaching and going towards. It's a goal. It's not the reality. And it's going to take all of us to do our part to shape it. But we got to start with making sure the foundation of the democracy is strong. And that starts with voting.
You said a couple of things that really triggered the social scientist in me and the mathematician in me. When you're talking about the ideal of the United States and striving toward an ideal of what does it mean to achieve a nation or reimagine a nation such that we won't have these issues. And I'm thinking like there's almost like an asymptotic relationship between where we are and where we'd like to go, right? Where we're like coming close to the edge, we're coming closer to the edge, and then the edge is there are going to be other issues, right? So I'm wondering, when we're talking about the ideal, what exactly is the ideal?
Yeah. And I think everybody has their own idea of what America should be, but we say we're the land of the free, the home of the brave, right? And I think it's really funny when people talk about freedom sometimes. I'm like, when have you not been free? But, this is supposed to be a melting pot. I think that through culture, our culture is different, obviously, than any other culture. And that's because we are bringing in so many diverse sets of culture, right? And, from our music to our entertainment to our food, like every single thing shows that when we all kind of come together and mix all of our ingredients together, there's something beautiful about it. And that's the thing. I lived overseas as a child in South Africa during the transition from apartheid to democracy. And, that is the thing that, people think about America first. They think about freedom. They think about, our culture. They think about the ideals that we stand for. They think about the stories that we've learned in school, like, which might have been wrong mostly, of us always leading the charge to freedom in other lands and, protecting democracy around the world and all of these different things. So, for me, for me, like we get closer and closer, as you said, to that ideal America, and you can feel it and you can touch it. And there are moments when you are in it and you're like, yes, this is it. But what I used to write on campaigns a lot is like, we're working to make the promise of America, the practice of America. And in order to actually do that, we have to recognize, where we've come from. We have to have real conversations about that to actually be able to move past some of these challenges and issues. We have to recognize that our institutions have been built up in a way to protect certain people, and really, honestly, white supremacy. That is what this country was built on. So we're dismantling all of these things right now with our conversations, with our votes, with the way in which we are moving, but it's going to take all of us. Yes. And because we've been, I think, very privileged in this country, not everybody, but a good number of us have.
Yeah, compared to where the globe is.
Compared to the world, yes. Like we're not worried about certain things. We've slept through many elections. We've discarded many elections. I don't talk about politics, or I don't do politics. It's like, what are you talking about? And if you don't do politics, politics is going to do you, and it's doing it. And I think it's this separation of like, there's the government, I don't know what they do, and here I am, I'm at brunch. Like we have to figure out what is that bridge, because we cannot be uninformed, we cannot be disengaged. And to be very fair, when all you can think about is putting food on the table and making sure your children have a roof over their heads, you don't have time to think about this stuff. But that's where we come in. That's where us who are privileged come in and have to, when we do go into the ballot box, we're not thinking about ourselves. And we're thinking about other people, and we're not thinking about how this just impacts my children. Well, how does it impact your children as well? And I think when we start to not be so selfish, even though our country was moving towards America first stuff, like that's just not the way of the world. We're all interconnected. I mean, look at inflation. People think that inflation just popped up with President Biden. And it's like, inflation's happening around the world. The euro and the dollar are equal. Like that's insanity. Which is ridiculous. So we have to recognize that we're a part of a global unit. We are part of, a national community of people. And until we stop thinking about ourselves first and trying to be first, then we won't be able to really reach, I think, the goals of and the ideals of what this country is supposed to be. And so we all have to take a self-inventory and just stop thinking about ourselves. So,
oh my gosh, we need to have speaking of brunch, I would love to sit down to have brunch and talk even more. An hour is not enough. I'm so interested. I'm so grateful that you mentioned South Africa and the time when you lived in South Africa. So for those who may not study history as closely, at least on a diasporic front. So South Africa gained I don't want to say its freedom. Apartheid legally ended in the early 90s, in 1990, 1991. And the people who were born following the end of apartheid, and this matters in terms of how we talk about the US, are literally known as the born free generation, right? I wish that the US or that just social convention named our generations to in a more precise fashion to really demonstrate where we are as a people, right? So rather than saying something like Gen Z or Gen X, which to me literally doesn't qualify too much, you have to know what it means. I wish we called ourselves the generation who were born after X, Y, and Z, or the generation. Yeah. It would just be a lot more.
It would be, and it would ground us,
situate us, yes,
in history. And I think that a big part of our challenge is that, I mean, we've heard this: if you don't know where you came from, you don't know where you're going. Well, a lot of us don't know where we've come from, and so it's holistically. I mean, when we talk about and people have mixed up critical race theory and they don't even know what it is at this
I'm
point.
not sure what that is. It's really just history.
It's just history. It's just telling the truth. It's saying that, in World War II, the United States didn't want to get involved, and only until Pearl Harbor, then it got involved, and then it went there. And it's the reality of it, not that like we were the victors and everything. So, I mean, that's just one small example, but it's like, how are we really telling the truth about our history so that we are equipping this next generation? And we've done them a disservice. And we continue to do them a disservice. And one thing I do want to say though, is as folks are going to the ballot box in the voting booth, there are folks in this country who are very organized to keeping things the same. And what I mean by that is, like school boards are the next frontier.
Say that again.
If you can't take over the state legislature, if you can't manipulate this or that, school boards is the next big thing. And folks are on that, they're focused on that, so that they can screw up another generation. So we really have to be like open and know what's going on. And I think what's really, really amazing about the school board situation is that like you can go to those meetings, they're public, you can run for school board. A lot of women get their start in public service by running for school board, but it's incredibly important so that we're not at this point again in our history where we have an electorate that is susceptible to disinformation or lies, that can't decipher what real news is, that can't name the three branches of government. Do we want to live in a society like that? Like we laugh, and we laugh at this on late night shows. I mean, but it's petrifying and it's also embarrassing. So can we make sure that we're setting up the next generations of Americans for success? I will say with Gen Z being the most diverse, they have, the most information ever. They are way more kind of civically inclined and focused, but there's a lot who are not. So we have our work cut out for us. And if you have young people in your lives, even if they're not your children, your nieces, your nephews, your cousins, your play people, whoever, you can play a role in their life and bring them into civic engagement.
I really appreciate you leading on or leaving off on that point. I'm a new mother. My son is 10 months and I'm already thinking about, he's so cool. He's super cute. He's going on 19 already. I already see it. But I think about the way that I move, right? And the way that I demonstrate to him, even in his infancy, engagement, right? Engagement with community. He sees me picking up trash on the street, right?
Yes.
Because I put him on my chest. He sees me, well, he will eventually see me. I'm newly it's not election, but really named to the Commission for Women in DC. These things are going to matter to him, right?
Absolutely.
And also to people around. One of the things you also just mentioned that strikes me, Stephanie, is that you do have a lot of people who are engaged in the civic process, and not because they're thinking about other people when they go to the ballot in the most impact in a positive way. They're thinking about it in a way where it's like, I have to vote my angle because I don't want for someone else to gain, right? Like as if voting, and I'm not talking specific issues, but as if voting with someone else in mind in a positive way means that they will completely lose, right? As if, gains civically are a zero-sum game. They're not, right? And I'm thinking namely of people who will vote against certain issues because they see, they perceive that their identity is at crisis by uplifting others, right? And so that too is another way of, I imagine, depressing, to use your language, depressing potential voters to come out and vote. What kind of conversations, hard conversations, might you have with a group of people like that?
Yeah, that are suppressed. Yeah, look, I think that through voting, obviously and Mrs. Obama said this is the only way to make your concerns obviously matter. And I know that there are many forces, obviously, that are voting against your interest. And in knowing that, it can feel you know, like these are kind of insurmountable odds. But I think that one thing that we always have to have when we're having conversations, especially when we're trying to get more people to participate and we're trying to help get them out of, you know, well, this doesn't matter and this side will always win and I feel under attack, all these things, is that this isn't a one and done conversation.
Yep.
This is an ongoing conversation. That's why, like, you know, in January, we should be holding conversations still like this, right? We shouldn't wait like, oh, it's relevant now. No, this is always relevant, right? So how are we facilitating ongoing conversations with hard conversations with the people in our lives?
Yeah.
I think one fun fact to know is that Mrs. Obama is an amazing like influencer mover of people. We have a whole bunch of celebrity co-chairs that join her, like Jennifer Lopez to Janelle Monáe to Chris Paul and Steph Curry. Also very awesome. But you, in fact, are the best influencer in people's lives that are in your life.
Yeah.
So the people you work with, go to school with, you know, mosque, church, synagogue, wherever, like you are the best influencer, and they will listen to you. So knowing that, being armed with that and coming to the table again and again and again and again, and having these conversations. And then also, you know, through our peer-to-peer organizing and like lifting people up and, hey, let's vote together. All of these things are known to help bring people closer and out of their potential, you know, voter suppression bubble. And we just have to have the mindset that it's not ever going to be a one and done conversation. And we want it to be, we want to be like, let me tell you the truth and read this article and you need to know, and I'm done. It's like,
that's right.
That just doesn't work. Oh gosh. And social media, honestly, like that, with the rise of social media is the decline of democracy around the world. And so there has to be regulations on how we pass and share information on social media. And there is a documentary that I encourage everybody to watch called Social Impact, that talks about the dangers that we are literally living in. I mean, Elon Musk just bought Twitter.
Right.
It's like we're in the twilight zone, but we're not. And so, you know, if you remember like back in the day, or like when we had these movies that would show these artificial intelligent creatures that would like end up killing us because they're so much smarter than us. I don't really think it's the creatures, it's social media. It's social media. If you think about it, it's like that is the thing that now is actually attacking our society. And it's not like a robot like we thought it would be or that we imagined. Those are still, you know, in the works. I've seen a couple, but we're talking about the way in which these platforms are used as a weapon for lies and a weapon for hate and a weapon for violence in our society. That is a real epidemic that we are all partaking in because we're all on the platforms and we all have some form of addiction to them and we don't even recognize it. So we got to take a step back too, to understand that like these microwave popcorn conversations that we'd like to have with people to, you know, change their mind or convert them or help them not read this crazy stuff that they read from this blogger who is nuts and they believe it's the truth. We have to understand that those things take time and time and time and time. And then there's some people that just, okay. But there's many that I'm sure would listen to you.
They'll certainly listen to you, and they're obviously going, and they will listen to you, big you, out in the universe there. And thank you for that charge, for ensuring that we're showing up in the spaces that we already occupy, and encouraging others to be involved, or at least to ask the questions, right? Because that also just brings closer engagement. Before I ask you two more questions, can you just clarify what's available on the website? One of the audience members must know if there are slides on the website.
So if you go to onemalevote.org, there's not slides on what necessarily we're talking about, but right now we're really pushing the 1-866 our vote number. That's the first thing you see. But if you scroll down, we tell you there's only 4 days until the election. And then we have a lot of tools for you. So you can check your status, your voter registration status, to make sure you're all good to go. In places like California and Michigan, you can do same day voter registration if you need to. You can find your polling place, which is critically important because things change. This is basically how you make your plan to vote too. You can, the vote by mail piece, I wouldn't even look at that at this point. Let's go ahead and you got to go ahead and vote in person. You can pledge to vote, which is another way of joining our team and getting our resources, but also, and ask other people in your family and your lives to do the same. And then you can see what's on your ballot, which is critically important. So You can look up your ballot, see the candidates that are on there, and read about them through our partners at Ballot Ready, and read all about the nonpartisan through a nonpartisan lens on what this person has done or hasn't done, and about ballot measures, so that when you do go to vote, you feel more informed. And then we also have what you need to know, which is just essentially like a voting 101, what you need to know about voting, and then knowing your rights. I mentioned we just had our Know Your Rights kind of call the other day, which I'm sure is on our YouTube page, which you should check out as well, with all of our videos. And then we have our events and training. So there's a ton of work, or not work, there's a ton of resources on our site. And then one thing I do like too is you can get some cute voting gear to go vote in as well. You can take a look in our store. We have some cute little outfits. We also have onesies for babies and all of those things. So make sure you take a look so that you are going to vote, because you can go vote in our gear because we're nonpartisan, as opposed to going in a polling place with a candidate or some sort of partisan message. And then if you want to just take a look at any of our trainings, if you go to our YouTube page, and it's just When We All Vote on YouTube, you'll be able to see all of our videos and all of our conversations that we have had about a lot of these different issues. And one big one that I would love for folks to take a look at is our Culture of Democracy Summit, where we convened thought leaders from a cross section of industries, from entertainment to music to sports, to those community leaders who are leading in civic engagement around the country, to talk about all of our collective, not just responsibility, but our roles in protecting and expanding democracy. So if you write a television show to if you run a classroom, it's about how all of us play a role in this work, and how we can all be a part of changing the culture of our democracy moving forward. And we have so much content from that, and a lot of amazing conversations, including one on the history of democracy with Nicole Hannah-Jones that opens up the day.
I love that. We literally have one more minute. The question I wanted to pose to you earlier, I want to go back to the hope piece. Tell us more about that, and why you really lead with hope.
Yeah, I told somebody the other day, I couldn't do this work if I was not a hopeful person. And luckily I came from one of the most positive people on the planet, who was my father, McKinley Young. He always believed in the best of people, and he always believed that things would turn around. And the folks that we work with every day, the everyday people who don't get paid to do this work, but are just fired up and excited about working in their communities, that makes me feel like this is the America that I envision living in and being a part of. And it's those young people who have so many different ideas on how they can impact this work through their work with My School Votes, or in their own high school, or in their own community. It's our staff who are filled with really, really young people who are talented, who can go many different places, but they want to use their gifts and talents for this work. It is, it's those people who stand in line to go vote in spite of everything. It's the memory of, my grandmother that never missed an election in her lifetime ever, but was a daughter of sharecroppers who lived with the disability of being severely hard of hearing. And managed to, migrate from Georgia to Boston and create a better life for her children, and had hope that this country could change. It's all of that. And I think that if we take a step back and we think about the people who've laid the pathway before us, if we look at your sweet baby and think about his future, you got to have some hope, right? And even though this is super crazy times, we know that, unprecedented, all the things.
Yeah.
I believe that we needed this as a nation, because we needed to get all of this out of our system, literally. So I'm glad people are blatantly racist and doing all the things. I'm like,
hey,
good.
Let me know right up front. Let me know right up front.
We can sweep this. We can finally try to push away and move past this. And you cannot move past anything you can't confront. So this is our confrontation. And though it's scary, and if you're like me, I'm not a fighter. I don't really like to fight. It's scary, but this is a fight for the soul of America. And I'm confident that we have enough people on our side that believe in good and believe in the best that we can be. So I hope that if you don't have anything, you have a little bit of hope, and look around you to find that inspiration. And I'm sure it's there.
Well, on those terms, Stephanie, I couldn't have said it better. Hope and through the fight and what's on the other side is something to be looking forward to. I very much thank you for coming. Again, just a reminder, Stephanie Young, Executive Director of When We All Vote. Go and visit whenweallvote.org. Make sure you've got the number on speed dial in your phone. I'm not sure if Brandon is coming back on to say goodbye, but I will say on behalf of everyone who's here, we thank you for bringing everything that you've brought to us today, and trust and believe that we will show up now for early voting and certainly by the 8th at the latest. So thank you, Stephanie. And I'm sure NMQF will stay in touch. Thank you, everybody, for being present.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye now.